So earlier this morning, there was a pretty big story that dropped regarding Aaron Rodgers by Matt Schneidman of The Athletic. And he spoke with Rodgers recently, and Rodgers went into more detail about exactly what went down between Rodgers and Brian Gutekunst and the Packers overall. So if you would like that full story, I'll leave the link to the article down below. It goes in tons of depth, really good article. And I'm going to touch on some of the biggest things that I read from this very interesting story this morning. Because this offseason, obviously before Rodgers was traded, there was debate as to did the Packers want to move on from Rodgers regardless, or are they potentially willing to keep Rodgers? There were lots of different questions and thoughts as to what the intentions of the Packers really were. And so starting off here, in the article, Matt Schneidman mentions that according to a source, last season, the Packers weren't satisfied with Rodgers' commitment to the team by not showing up to OTAs. And then Rodgers responded saying this: When I'm in, I'm all in. And you want to ride with off-season workouts? Rodgers said, I won MVP without doing off-season workouts. Like, was my commitment any less then? I'd say not at all. The way that I come back to work, not just physically in good shape, but mentally refreshed, is the best thing for me to have the season I wanted to have during those in Green Bay. I think that's just a cop-out written to try and find something to disparage me about that honestly, when you know what off-season workouts are really about, it's completely ridiculous. So Rodgers clearly does not agree with the whoever it is that said that the Packers were not satisfied with his commitment. He clearly believes he was committed, and I think he was committed. I think there's obviously that debate around fans in the NFL, how important are OTAs, how important are off-season workouts, and I think there's no doubt that having every player there is probably more helpful if you're able to build that chemistry with all the guys on your team. But Rodgers thinks that he was better off spending his time away, refreshing his mind. And I think for a player who's at the level that Rodgers was at and still is at, the age he's at, he's gone through so many different off seasons. And my opinion at the time last season was that if Rodgers not showing up to OTAs and him having more time to himself, getting to refresh himself, if that was what was going to lead to Rodgers coming back to Green Bay and being in, a good state, then I was all for that happening. I'd say typically I prefer a guy to be there, but in this situation, I think it made sense for Rodgers not to, show up to OTAs, even though it could have been helpful. And then moving on, apparently after this season, the Packers told Aaron Rodgers they wanted him to retire a Packer. So then, of course, Rodgers leaves. He goes probably back home to California to contemplate his future. Does he want to return to Green Bay? Does he want to retire a Packer? Or does he want to potentially get traded somewhere else? And so there were a couple months where Rodgers was contemplating making his decision. And a little bit after that, of course, we get the news that Brian Gutekunst said that he tried to reach out to Rodgers and that Rodgers did not answer his phone. And so because of that, Brian Gutekunst said they started shopping him around because they had to make preparations in the case that Rodgers didn't want to return to Green Bay. But apparently Rodgers said that there was actually some more communication that maybe Brian Gutekunst led on in that one interview about a month or so ago. And he said this: Did Brian text me more than I texted him? Yeah, but did I ghost him? No, Rodgers said. I texted him back. There was back and forths that we had. And so this is the story you want to go with. You're going to stand on this hill of austerity and say that arguably in the conversation of the best player in your franchise history, you're going to say I couldn't get a hold of him and that's why we had to move on. Like, come on, man. Just tell the truth. You wanted to move on. You didn't like the fact that we didn't communicate all the time. Like, listen, I talk to the people I like. So Rodgers being very honest that he seems to not be very fond of Brian Gutekunst and basically saying that they did speak with each other, at least in text form, and so there was some kind of communication going on there. I do wonder what they were saying to each other, but there's clearly been a rift between the two of them for a very long time, and my guess in this situation is that Brian Gutekunst likely wanted to move on to Jordan Love, and so because Rodgers hadn't given him the answer yet, he started to make preparations in the case that Rodgers did want to end up getting traded, and I understand that that idea from the Packers' perspective because let's say Rodgers does enter the darkness retreat and he comes out and says, I want to be traded. At least the Packers would have some leads on maybe who would want to trade so they could get a trade done. But Rodgers clearly thought that maybe they should have spoken with him sooner. And one other interesting tidbit that came out here. Rodgers said this: before I went in the darkness, I hit him up and said, hey, there's some stuff swirling around here. We should get together, you, me, and Matt. So Rodgers, before the darkness retreat, which I think is very interesting, reached out to them, don't know who specifically, and said he wanted to meet up with I think Brian Gutekunst, Matt LaFleur, and sort of discuss things. And so the fact that Rodgers left the darkness retreat and had the news that the Packers were shopping him around, I think he felt that the Packers weren't being completely honest with him. I assume that Rodgers wanted them to, sort of share with him what they were doing before they did it. And I understand the Packers' perspective. I understand Rodgers wanting to maybe be communicated with a little bit more. And so overall, it just seems that there actually was some kind of communication going on between Rodgers and the front office, because for a while it seemed like maybe nothing happened. And in that aspect, it completely makes sense that the Packers were making preparation. But Rodgers, before the darkness retreat, was trying to reach out to get together with the Packers. So it's a pretty interesting situation, and we did get some more information from this Matt Schneidman article, which is linked down below. There's a lot more information. Should definitely go read it. Really, really great article, really great story. But overall, I think that the Packers did want to move on to Jordan Love, and I think that Rodgers sort of felt that. I think that Rodgers knew that the Packers' plan was to move on to Love. And so without them really explaining it to him, I think that Rodgers felt like maybe they just should have been more open and honest about their intentions. And because they weren't, and because they shopped him around without him knowing, he wanted to get traded to the New York Jets. So now, of course, we're moving into 2023 with Rodgers on the Jets, Jordan Love starting on the Packers. But that's all I have for this one. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to stay up to date with all Packers news, feel free to subscribe to the channel. But that's all I have for this one, and I'll see you guys next time.